On screen, you should see a summary wordle of last week's discussion. From time to time, I take this approach to try to wrap up our discussions, and I think that last week was probably one of the most appropriate weeks for this approach. And that is, how do I capture the conversation when we're talking about something like feedback? How do we receive feedback and how do we give feedback? So I went through and I jotted down some phrases and words that jumped out at me from the discussion, and then I was able to categorize those into the 3 discussion wrap-up bullets you see on the screen: considerations, approaches, and emotions. But then I also took the content of our posts and threw them into wordle.net just to see what were the words used most frequently. I did take out feedback because it was giant. Obviously, if we're talking about feedback, we would keep using that word. So this way we could get kind of an unfettered view of what the conversation entailed. And I find it interesting that change is fairly large and that work and giving are fairly large, along with think. We often couch or approach our phrasing, I think that, or I believe that. I thought it was interesting that think jumped out at us. But within the 3 categories, first up, considerations. What do I mean by considerations? Well, considerations that we make with respect to giving and receiving feedback. One of the comments I noticed was that of value. And what is the value in the feedback? Which kind of gets at situational. Is the feedback being given or received in a classroom setting, in a work setting, in a volunteer setting? Who's giving the feedback? Is it a peer versus a leader? Those are the considerations that came up as we talked about what are the pros and cons of feedback and what have we experienced personally. But then that leads us into the different approaches that each of you discussed. Whether these were approaches that you personally take, approaches that you've seen and viewed as successful or not so successful, or approaches that have been taken with you to give you feedback. And along those lines, I know that there was a comment about being blunt and how sometimes that can be perceived in a different way or in a negative way. Another approach involved asking questions, and I really did enjoy that component of the discussion because asking questions is a key way to move beyond the superficial. Why did you do something a particular way? Or why did you select a particular color or a particular image? Digging into the questions that get into design decisions can help us move beyond the I like it or I don't. But then that also brings us around to the idea of how do we avoid hurting feelings? How do we exercise discretion? There was a scenario or an entry that talked about how you can tell how much work an individual put into a particular artifact, yet it clearly does not meet standards. And you don't want to hurt that person's feelings. You want to exercise discretion so that you can get at helping them improve. And that was another aspect, that positive or negative, we're wanting to influence behavior. So the last thing I want to mention under approaches is that of phrasing. And Mike Deal gets the hat tip this week for the comment about how do you phrase your feedback. There's a big difference in receiving feedback that says, this is the wrong color, when it's bright red text on a bright purple background, versus I'm curious as to why you chose to use red text on a purple background. Do you think other colors might have improved the visibility? Rewind the video and replay that segment if you need. But think about the difference in phrasing and how that can influence the way feedback is received. And it gets at the asking questions component. But then the last thing I want to mention are emotions. Feedback can be stressful, and we need to find ways to work through that. The other thing I saw mentioned towards the end of the discussion was that of empathy and empathizing different design decisions. So when I'm teaching ITEC 5320 and 5350, which are both very design-heavy courses, I have to exercise empathy at times. And what I typically do is revert back mentally to when I was a novice designer and I was making particular decisions and why I made those decisions. So by exercising that empathy, I can also think about how was I able to move beyond certain issues or certain design problems. Interesting conversations last week. So thank you very much. And with that, let's turn to this week. Use the on-screen navigation to access another section of this week's overview.
Paints the sky just after sunrise.